Hi, everybody, and welcome back. We are going to start talking about physical and cognitive development in infancy. So, upon birth, the baby's weight is going to be dominated by their head, and relative to their body, the baby's head is going to be quite large. But in the first 2 years, organ development and body development will catch up with great rapidity. There are two major principles of infant growth. There's cephalocaudal development and there's proximodistal development. So a way to remember this, cephalocaudal development, that root word, that root prefix cepha, is cephalic. It's short for it. That means head. Okay. And this is where growth patterns follow the head and the upper body parts, and then they proceed to the rest of the body parts. Um, This should make sense because this is why we develop our visual abilities. It's at the top of our body before we develop other abilities like learning to walk. That's an example of cephalocaudal development, that everything up here is going to develop first, and development as we move down the body is going to happen later. There's also proximodistal development, which is sort of the opposite to cephalocaudal development. And that is going to be the development that proceeds from the trunk of the body outwards, which means we're talking about our arms and our legs. Okay. And there's going to be greater rapidity of growth in the arms and legs during this period. Also, what takes place during this period is something called hierarchical integration. And hierarchical integration are simple skills that develop separately and independently, but ultimately they combine to become a greater set of skills. So, for example, let's talk about grasping and finger and hand strength, right? In order to hold an item, babies must first learn to manipulate their fingers. So, the development starts with their fingers in order to escalate to greater development of being able to hold toys and grasp things. Okay. Um, we also have the independence of systems, and that's going to be that there are multiple systems that are going to develop throughout development. They don't necessarily happen all at the same time. They happen at different rates. So, for example, we're going to have body size and growth is going to happen at one rate. Nervous system development is going to be happening at the same time, but it's not necessarily going to be always at the same time. And then we have things like sexual maturation. All of these things are going to develop at different rates. Okay, so independence of systems. They're all within the body and they're all contributing to the greater function of the body, but and they can all happen at the same time, but they all happen at different rates. We talked about plasticity, so I'm not going to repeat that here. But something that's important to note is that newborns sleep 16 to 17 hours per day. It's a lot of hours. It's bizarre because somehow they sleep that many hours and somehow you're still overwhelmingly busy taking care of them despite the fact that they sleep so much. And part of that is because sleep is done in bursts. Okay, so they sleep and they sleep really deep and then they burst into wakeful states where care is needed. Around the time they hit 4 months, they should be able to start sleeping about 6 or so straight hours. Again, this is going to depend on the baby. My son didn't start sleeping 6 straight hours until 7 months, right? So there's wiggle room here, and if they're not hitting this benchmark immediately at 4 months, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's a problem, because there's the issue of plasticity. When infants sleep, they sleep in REM sleep, which is going to be our deepest stage of sleep. And 50% of the time when they're sleeping, they're in REM, which means they're in really, really, really deep, restful sleep. When you compare that to grown-ups, most of our sleep, we are only in REM about 20% of the time. And this is, if you've ever woken up in the middle of a REM stage and you wake up and you're like, my gosh, I was sleeping so deeply, right? So there's different stages of sleeping, and REM is the deepest, and each one beyond that, you're more easily woken up, okay, because you're just not in a deep state of sleep. However, as the months go by, usually by around 4 months, that 50% of REM sleep starts to decrease. They still sleep a lot, but they don't sleep as deep. Okay, so those early months, it's bizarre because you can vacuum and you can make lots of noise in the kitchen, and as the really young infants will just sleep right through all of it. But somewhere around 4 months, that REM starts to dial back a little bit and they're sleeping and they will wake at those noises. Okay, now something we have to talk about in tandem with infant sleep, unfortunately, is sudden infant death syndrome, which is referred to as SIDS. It's also referred to as a SUDI death. Okay, when a child dies of sudden infant death syndrome, it is what we call a SUDI death, which is sudden unexplained infant death investigation. SIDS death happened under the age of 12 months. Okay. And largely they are unexplained. They are unexplained deaths. Okay. Children under the age of 1 seem to just pass in their sleep, and we don't completely know why. We don't know why this happens. There are some theories as to why it happens. One of the prevailing theories is that they get into that extraordinarily deep REM sleep where all of our systems, when we are in REM, slow down, our heart rate slows down, our respiration rate slows down. And one of the theories is that they go deeper than REM, right? And the systems just shut down altogether, and they slip away, right? Which is obviously an incredible tragedy when it happens. Other SUDI deaths that are common, unfortunately, it's not an overly common thing, but when it happens, common causes are going to be things like asphyxiation. Okay. Remember that newborn babies and babies they can't sit up yet. They don't have neck control, so they can't turn their heads. So if their face and their nasal passageways gets exposed to things like stuffed animals, pillows, bumpers on the crib, or if you have a soft mattress and it sinks down and their nasal passageways become occluded, they can't breathe and they die of asphyxiation. This also happens with co-sleeping. You should not be co-sleeping with an infant in your bed. Okay. If you roll over and their nasal passageways get covered, they can't move. And they also can't cry to let you know that they're in distress, and they asphyxiate and die. Okay. These are all examples of SUDI deaths. Any death here in Pennsylvania that occurs under the age of 12 months, by law, requires a mandatory investigation and autopsy to make sure that there was not foul play. Many of these are what we call SIDS deaths or SUDI deaths. We don't know the cause. We just don't know. I mean, we don't know what happened. But one of the things that research has done over time is told us how to mitigate SIDS death. We don't know what causes it, but we do have some variables that if you manipulate these variables, we know that the likelihood of a SIDS death decreases drastically. And once you hit that 12-month mark, the likelihood of a SIDS death almost disappears, right? So, as parents of babies, it's a wonderful time. But yes, as a mom, I worried all the time about SIDS, right? Many parents, myself included, will go in while the baby's sleeping to make sure, is that chest rising up and down? Yes, it is. And when you hit that 12-month mark, it is a huge relief, okay? Because statistically, we just don't see SIDS deaths after 12 months with any kind of regularity. Mm. However, we have learned over the years that there are some things that mitigate SIDS. There are also some variables that make it more likely. So, for example, SIDS is in fact the leading cause of death for children under the age of 1. Okay, and there are some things that increase that. So, having things in the crib is a SIDS risk. The bumpers that go around the crib that are quilted and they're really cute. I mean, they're adorable, but you got to get rid of them, right? They're a danger. Okay, for that asphyxiation. You have to have a firm mattress. We don't want a soft mattress because of that sinking down problem. Also, because if somehow the baby gets moved in the night and they sink between the mattress and the crib, the end of the crib, and they get caught and then they asphyxiate, it's more likely to happen with a soft mattress than with a firm mattress. Every baby should always get a brand new mattress. Don't keep a mattress from a previous infancy to make sure that it is completely firm and it's robust. It's not getting worn down. There shouldn't be blankets. There shouldn't be stuffed animals. There shouldn't be any decorations, right? Because all of those are asphyxiation risks. And that's why we have things like sleep sacks, right? It acts as a blanket, but it can't come up over the baby's face and cause them to asphyxiate. Houses where there are smoking, we see a much greater risk of SIDS deaths, which gets back with some basic support for that idea that the respiration here is an issue, that respiration in SIDS babies just seems to fail and shut down. And certainly in houses where there's smoking, there's secondhand smoke, the air quality is poor, they're going to have a harder time breathing and having adequate oxygen into their system. So, if you smoke, you need to quit. You need to quit. You need to quit once there's a newborn baby in the house. Um, Back sleeping is the big one. Okay, for years and years and years, all the way up through the 80s and the 90s, doctors were saying, put the newborn baby on their tummy. They sleep deeply, and what we find is that when we do back sleeping, when we say do not put the baby on their stomach and we put them on the back, the SIDS risk actually decreases by 50%. That is a huge number. That once we started telling people, put your baby on their back to sleep, always, we saw the number of SIDS deaths decrease by 50%, right? So there are some things that we can do to minimize and mitigate, Okay, like I said, there's no known cause for SIDS. Some of the theories include that it could be undiagnosed sleep disorders. There could be some sort of illness there that they're just too young, that we haven't been able to. They haven't manifested symptoms. It's there. We just don't know it's there. Suffocation for sure is a driving factor in SIDS, right? For sure. Which is why we say keep that crib empty. Do not co-sleep, right? um Possibly nutritional defense deficiencies, possibly problems with reflexes, that natural reflexes aren't working and then the respiration is shutting down. Okay. There is no known clear variable that is affiliated with SIDS. This affects babies of all races, all incomes. It's a equal opportunity tragedy, unfortunately. Okay. So but we do have those mitigating factors that need to be done for the health and the welfare of the infant. Okay. Reflexes are inborn and physical skills are present at birth for survival. We're born just knowing how to do certain things. We don't have to think about it. We don't have to actively do it. It just happens and they're there so that we can survive. And there's a litany of those reflexes. The first one is going to be the swimming reflex. And that is when we place a baby on their stomach, you're going to see their arms do this and their feet kick out. And it looks like they're swimming even though they're not. This is to create movement in the child for survival. Eye blinking is an innate reflex that we're born with, and it's there to keep the eyes moist. It's there to protect the eyes from trauma. The rooting reflex is when the baby will automatically turn its head towards whatever's stroking their cheek. So if you do this to a baby's cheek, they will turn their head in the direction of the stroke. And the thought process here is that this is to aid in feeding, that when it's time for feeding, you get their attention and they turn their head to latch on to get feeding, to get sustenance. There's also the stepping reflex, and this is when a child will, if you hold them upright by their arms, under their arms, their feet will begin to just look like they're walking, even though they can't even stand yet. And this is a reflex that prepares them to learn how to walk down in time down the road. The Moro reflex is that when support for the head and neck are removed, because remember, they are not born with fully developed neck muscles. This takes a period of months. We say, doctors, pediatricians will say, put the baby on their tummy while they're awake. It's called tummy time. And you will see, and it's painful for new moms that, they're struggling to lift their head and they usually cry and scream and you feel terrible. But it's actually important for development because it's strengthening and exercising those neck muscles. They say half an hour of tummy time a day where they will do that. But in the meantime, until those neck muscles develop, we have the Moro reflex, and that's when the head and the neck isn't supported. The infant will automatically reach out for something, and that is known as protection from falling. It's a safety reflex. There's something called the Babinski reflex, and the reason it has that name Babinski is the person who discovered it, their last name was Babinski. So, it doesn't have a special meaning. That's just their name. It was named after them. And this is when you tickle or you drag your finger across the bottom of a baby's feet. Their toes will fan out when you strike the bottom of it. And we don't know why this happens. We don't know what the value of this reflex is, but we know we are born with it, and it is consistent across all infants. The startle reflex is something that happens a lot. You will see it. It's actually really cute, right? They do it while they're sleeping. They do it while they're awake. Where in response to a sudden noise, the baby will fling out their arms, they'll arch their back, because they're looking for protection. They're scared. They're feeling a threat to their welfare. So you'll see them sleep, and some a noise will happen, and they'll go, they'll reach out, and then my son used to always come back and grab his nose. It's super cute. But it's a survival reflex, a protection reflex. The sucking reflex is when infants have a tendency to suck anything that touches their lips. This is for food intake and survival. This is a natural reflex so that when we go to breastfeed, they immediately reflexively know how to latch on. In order to get nutrition and sustenance. It is a reflex, but even then, some babies do have a hard time latching on to the breast, and we'll talk about breastfeeding here shortly. And then finally, we have the gag reflex, and infants tend to, we have this reflex where your throat closes up, and it's protection against choking, right? Which is obviously really important. Okay, so all of these reflexes, if you've noticed, they revolve around survival, sustenance, and safety, right? Survival so that they don't get hurt or die. Sustenance so they're making sure that they bring nutrition into the body so they can grow, so they can maintain, and safety, okay? Babies don't have to learn to do any of this. We're just born with it, okay? We're just born with it. Nutritional development at this stage is of paramount importance, right? Infants grow rapidly. It's crazy that you will go from a newborn and then in 4 months you're like, wow, it's only been 4 months and this is not a newborn anymore. This is a big solid baby. And in order to do that, they have to be properly fueled by nutrition. Newborns feed constantly every 1 to 2 hours, and they will feed like that for a good 4 weeks, right? And part of the reason for that is because they are so small and their stomachs are so small. At the time of birth, when they're infants, their stomach is about this big. It's about the size of a large marble, which means it fills up really quickly, right? But it also processes through really quickly. So it fills up really quickly. They don't tend to feed for terribly long. Um, they get full, they fall back asleep, but blam, sometimes like within an hour, they're hungry again because that tiny little marble sized stomach has digested everything, it's gone through, and they're hungry again, right? They're hungry again. So they will feed with frequency. As they grow and get bigger and their stomach gets bigger, the feedings will begin to spread out because they can hold more in their system. It provides more sustenance, and they can go for longer periods of time between feeding. Okay. But if they lack nutrition and if they're not getting adequate feeding, they're not going to grow. And at this point, it's so important because there's so much growth that happens in the first year that they need constant, adequate nutrition. Okay. Research demonstrates that breastfeeding is best and should be ideally done for the first 12 months. Now, I know culturally this is somewhat controversial because most moms work, right? This is just where we are culturally in our society, is that you can't afford to live on one income. So it becomes, breastfeeding becomes a much bigger task when you have to go to work, because you're not there to freshly feed the baby. You have to pump. Pumping is difficult. There's a lot of issues with breastfeeding, like getting breast infections and mastitis. But I will say, as somebody who, I'm a huge proponent of breast milk over formula. Remember that this is a brand new infant with a naked immune system. Okay. And you are putting, if you're giving them formula, you are putting synthetic powder into their body for nutrients. And while I'm not saying that that's never okay. I'm not saying that, because it does work, right? But what your body produces is perfect for them. We have a lot of formula fed babies that end up with reflux because their bodies are saying no to the powdered nutrition. You don't get babies with reflux when they are breastfeeding because your body can't produce something that will give them reflux. Okay. If you eat some spicy foods, they might be like, they might not like that, right? But it passes very quickly and you're not going to have a chronic issue with reflux, which is going to lead to a lot of crying, a lot of colickiness, etc. But there are so many benefits to breast milk, right? We don't see the allergies to the formula. We don't see it. We don't see the reflux. Breast milk is sterile, so you don't have to sterilize anything in the middle of the night, right? You get up, you take your breast out, and you feed, right? It's on demand. So the more the baby eats, the more that will be produced. The less the baby eats, the less that will be produced. It's the most nutritious food source for a baby. Okay. It passes on my immunity, mom's immunity to the baby. Remember, we have a lifetime, or however old you are when you have that baby. I was 29 when I had mine. I had 29 years of exposure to illness and 29 years to build immunity to illness. Your baby is brand new and that immunity is not there yet. Okay, so they are vulnerable. One of the most amazing things that breast milk does is it takes my immunity and it passes it to my baby through my breast milk, providing them with better health protection. It's more easily digested with formula. There's a whole lot less digestive issues with babies who are breastfed over babies who are formula fed. This is a big one. It enhances cognitive development. Now, if you listen to the formula companies who conduct their own research, they will say that there is no cognitive difference between a formula fed baby and a breast milk fed baby. Possibly 1 to 3 IQ points, which is negligible in terms of cognitive function. If you look at independent research that is not paid for by formula companies, we see upwards of a difference of 10 IQ points, that breastfed babies have a higher IQ by 10 points over formula fed babies. And that's not negligible. That's noteworthy. So there's better cognitive development. Postpartum weight loss for mom. You put 10 pounds of your pregnancy is put on specifically, you're building a fat store to prepare for breastfeeding, because when you're breastfeeding, all the things that you eat are coming right out of your breast and going into your baby. And especially when those early stages when they're feeding constantly, you need that storage, okay? Because you're going to go through that 10 pounds very, very quickly, very, very quickly, right? With as quickly as they're feeding. So that postpartum weight comes right off, right? It comes right off. You don't have to diet. You don't have to exercise. Nature has it set up just for you. And most importantly, it's emotional bonding between mom and baby. It's quiet time where you have skin to skin contact, where you're just spending time together bonding. Okay. Other bit bonus, it's free, right? There's never a shortage. Remember, we recently went through a formula shortage. People couldn't get their hands on it. There's never a shortage of breast milk. Okay. There's never, and it's free. Formula is very, very costly. Okay. So once we shift, we don't completely shift away from breast milk. At 6 months, you should still be breastfeeding. But we start introducing solid foods to supplement nutritional needs in addition to breastfeeding. If a child isn't getting adequate nutrition, they're going to suffer from malnutrition, which is going to negatively impact growth and development. Malnutrition can stunt growth. It can result in a lower IQ that stays at that lower IQ. Even after the nutrition is improved. So this is something that we want to stay on top of, because if you miss that window or if we fall into that deficit, in some cases, you can't get out of it with certain areas of development. Um, Nutrition is largely a problem in developing countries, but unfortunately, it also happens here in the United States, not because we don't have access to nutrients. We do. It's just our food supply is not the healthiest, which we've already talked about. So you want to be cognizant of that when you are pregnant, and certainly cognizant when you're breastfeeding. Given that window for development and nutrition is so important and it's so short term, and if you miss it, there are going to be permanent deficits. We have a lot of social programs, including SNAP, which is the Supplemental Nutritional and Assistance Program, so that if mom and dad don't have adequate funds to provide adequate food and nutrition for kids in that stage, there are social and government resources to make sure that kids are getting what they need in terms of nutrition, and that economic circumstances aren't holding people back and resulting in kids who are malnourished, whose growth and development are stunted. And finally, let's talk about development of the senses. Sight infants are born with the ability to see well at close proximities, but they lack the ability to see clearly at distances. It's still going to be very fuzzy for them. But as they grow and develop, their eyesight they get stronger acuity. They can start seeing things with more acuity. Auditory perception, they can hear while they're in the womb. So by the time they're born, they already know mom and dad's voice, which is really cool, right? They are born with sound localization, which allows them to determine the direction of noises, right? So instead of just hearing an overwhelming cacophony that they don't know what's what, if they hear a noise, they know which direction they might turn their head or turn their eyes in that direction because they have auditory perception. Smell and taste are the senses that are the most strongly developed, and are present at birth. Babies who are only 2 weeks old can distinguish the smell of their mothers from the smell of strangers, right? They can tell the difference just by their olfactory senses. They have a proclivity for sweet foods and a natural distaste for bitter flavors, right? And finally, touch. So infants are born with a strong sense of touch. And remember, that is hugely important for bonding. It's hugely important for growth and development. And it's also how they explore their world.